Thank you again. So here to talk about how to set a customer-centric vision and a strategy to realize that vision. We've got a kind of active agenda here. I wanted to provide a little bit of overview, talk about a framework that we've created called vision-led product management, and then walk through the process of creating a vision and a strategy. So I'll start with personas and key outcomes, which is sort of the foundation of your vision. Talk about how do you actually craft a vision and explain it, work backwards from that vision to create a strategic plan, and then make sure that you're balancing your roadmap between making progress towards that vision and the near-term things that come with SaaS platforms these days. I do have an example, and so hopefully I have some time to actually look at a case study here, and then we'll of course have some time at the end for questions. So with that, I'm going to jump into this super high level about me. I've been doing product for about 16 years now, mostly at startups. I've worked at 6. Been fortunate enough to see 3 exits, a couple acquisitions, and 1 IPO. The largest team I managed after the last acquisition was 40 people, and that was with a $40 million portfolio in the financial services space. And in the last 3.5 years or so, I've now become an advisor and coach to more than 30 companies. And over that time, we at Prodify, which is where the product advisory firm I run, have worked with about 75 companies over the past 7 years. And from that, we've kind of captured these concepts and created that framework I mentioned, vision-led product management, which is all about setting a clear vision. And last year we released a book called Build What Matters that intended to capture all of that. And so, I wanted to do a quick overview of what the framework is. And in order to do that, I'm going to do an exercise. So if you want to come off your video, great. If not, no worries. Just get ready to use the Slack reaction buttons because I'm going to ask a series of questions for y'all. All right, great. See some videos coming on. All right, so I want you to imagine for a minute that you're down here in Austin, Texas with me. We've got great barbecue. We've got a football team that'll break your heart every Saturday. And usually we have pretty good weather, except in February. Now, imagine that we're all standing downtown and a bus pulled up. How many of you would get onto that bus if you had no idea where it was going? You can raise your hands, do thumbs up. Okay, not many takers. All right, I see a no from someone. Great. Let me change the question. What if we were in Austin and I told you that the bus was going to San Francisco? How many of you would get onto that bus? All right, I see some maybes. I see 1 thumbs up. Okay, let me switch the question again. Put your hands down. What if it was going from Austin to Washington, D.C.? How many of you would get onto that bus? All right, still some different answers. Some people still saying yes, still some people saying no. Let me complicate things even more. From Austin to San Francisco, what if I told you it was an outdoor adventure and that we were going to stop at a national park every night and go camping? How many of you want to get onto that bus? Yes, way more people. Yes. All right, good. All right, put your hands down. From Austin to Washington, D.C., what if it was the City Slicker Tour and we were going to stop at a bunch of nice restaurants and museums and cocktail lounges? How many of you would want to get onto that bus? Okay, different people. Let me bring it back home. We're here to talk about product and product vision. Let me connect the dots here. Imagine for a second that the bus is your product, the passengers are your customers and your stakeholders. That final destination, San Francisco, Washington, D.C., that's your product vision. The route that you're going to take from Austin to that final city is your product strategy. And that the daily itinerary of how you're going to get from city A to city B. So, from Austin to DC, we might go from Austin to New Orleans that first day. That's your product roadmap. These are the details about how you're going to leave. And so that's sort of the concept and the core concept behind the framework here. Sorry, I just pulled up the chat, so I'll answer some questions in there. And the core concept of the framework is if you don't have any sense of where you're headed, then when you come to a fork in the road like this, it's all going to sound good and it's going to be interesting, right? And so with that, we created this vision-led framework. I'll give you the overview here, and then we'll do a deep dive. So the core concept, as with all product management, is like we're going to look forward from today into the future. Our metric of progress is what we would call the customer outcome. That is, we're not going to talk about what business goals we're trying to achieve. We're trying to talk about what value can we create for customers, because as long as we've got a reasonable business model and pricing and packaging, we should be able to capture some of that value back and create and hit some of our business goals. And so in the same way that if you were on that bus, your metric of progress would be how many miles have we driven. We use this y-axis to say how much value have we created to customers and progress towards the outcomes that they care about in their lives. From there, we say, okay, let's set a time in the future. Normally, we say it's 3 or 4 years in the future. It may vary by company. And let's create a customer journey vision. That is, I want to explain what I want my customer experience to look like at some point in the future. From there, we work backwards to create what we would call that strategic plan, which is what are all the things we would need to do to make that vision a reality. And between these key milestones on the strategic plan, that's the roadmap. And so that's the concept we're going to kind of walk through here today in the framework. So the first thing we're going to start with is target personas and key outcomes. And I'll kind of show you what this process looks like when we work with companies to implement the vision-led framework to help set a vision and strategy. The first thing we want to do is what are the metrics, not only for the business, but also for customers? How do they know if the product is successful? From there, we envision that customer journey. What do we want the experience to look like? And how can we 10x sort of what the customers are trying to achieve compared to what they have available to them today? Working backwards from that, we create the product strategy or strategic plan. Then we prioritize to create a roadmap, and then we execute. So we're going to cover these first four sort of like boxes here today. I'm going to start with this first one. So to me, the two foundational questions you have to answer when you're trying to set a product vision is who is our product for and why would they use it? In particular, what are they trying to accomplish, right? And so to answer that first question, we still like personas. I know there's been a little bit of debate in the sort of like product community on this, but the persona is intended to be a fictitious person who represents sort of like a broad market of people, right? But it helps you, whether that's a buyer or a user, and they're intended to help us remember who are we building our product for. There are people and lives behind all the metrics we look at in our product analytics dashboard, right? And you don't want to forget about them. And I think you can think of this simply as a way of categorizing the different people who are trying to extract value from your product. Some might be internal, some might be external. You might have like buyers, you might have users, all those things. And it's really important to call those out. For each of the personas you identify that you're trying to serve, and you may have to make some tough choices on who you serve and don't serve, we then talk about what is the key outcome that they're trying to accomplish. And so the definition that we use for a key outcome is an end goal that a person wants to accomplish because it's important in their life. So let me kind of bring this back to reality here. Let's look at a couple of examples of both a persona and a key outcome. The persona example I'm going to use is just from O-Power. So O-Power was a startup I worked at in the DC area. We used to send this type of report to residential energy customers, and it said, here's how your energy usage compares to your neighbors. We used behavioral science and basically learned that this was the most effective way to drive energy efficiency savings at scale with residential customers. And so here's an example of the persona that we used within our team. And this is Joyce. She's the hobby saver. I won't go into the details here, but you can see that our design team actually made some convenient sort of sliders on the dimensions in which we were segmenting our users. And to me, the most interesting thing about Joyce was we all went to O-Power to work for sort of the sustainability mission, right? We felt that there were major environmental benefits to reducing energy consumption across the globe. And so, you might imagine that like, yeah, most of these people care about saving the environment. Well, we knew that wasn't true after running the experiments and realizing that the neighbor comparison was actually the thing that was motivating them. Later, we learned that there was actually this subsegment of folks who really cared about the cost savings. And so, you could imagine how that was a little bit of a surprise, but it was very helpful for us to help understand how to motivate someone like Joyce, who was the persona that was motivated by money and was willing to sacrifice comfort to save money, which is an interesting aspect of energy usage that we use to tailor the product experience. Let's look at some key outcomes. Again, the idea behind the key outcome is not to just ask like, what does this product do for you? And then ask them and expect them to explain the sort of like feature set, but instead to talk about what are you trying to accomplish and why? So some examples here. You don't use Twitter to read tweets, but you use it to stay connected or feel updated on the news, right? I don't get on the Peloton just because I like to cycle. I do it because I'm trying to stay in shape and lose weight, right? I don't use Slack because I like chatting or like looking at all these little red dots in my browser window. I use it because I'm trying to collaborate with people and achieve goals together. Similarly, you don't use Salesforce to just attract deals, right? You're trying to close more deals more efficiently. And those are the key concepts here. So with that foundation of the persona and that key outcome that they're trying to serve, we then move into the step of sort of envisioning how do we 10x that metric for these folks. And There's a lot of ways to express a product vision. Here's sort of a 2x2 matrix where we kind of call out like, look, there's very verbal versions of product visions, a document, that 40-page document that might be shared internally. There's very visual ones. There's high level, product positioning statements you might have seen versus like detailed like stories about how the customer is going through the experience. You'll note here that we have a preference for sort of highly visual and detailed stories. The reason is the vision is intended to inspire. And so if it's so detailed that it takes, 2 hours to read it, you're never going to be able to get your key point around, right? You want people to understand it quickly, nod their heads and get excited by it, right? And want to go work on this vision. When we talk about how to set the vision, we talk about a very holistic customer journey. And so we think of the customer experience in sort of chapters, and there's 6 of them. The first one is that triggering moment where someone's banging their head against the wall because the existing product or solution just is not helping them achieve the outcome that they care about or in a way that they're satisfied with. There's a discovery phase where they start researching alternatives. Obviously this is where your product marketing starts coming into play. Similarly, once they find new products, there's an evaluation criteria, right? There's a bunch of check boxes they're checking in their head. There's a bunch of questions they're asking as they look at products and wondering if it could be better. Hopefully they get past that phase and they move into a trial where they start kicking the tires, right? And we use the phrase trial like kind of generically. In the B2B context, this might be a pilot. In the D2C context, it might be, a free 30-day trial of a mobile app or something like that. And hopefully from there, they realize that there's value and move into ongoing usage. This is, of course, where most product teams will spend their time, which is thinking about what's driving regular usage. And then it comes full circle, right? Which is when push comes to shove and this customer or user has a chance to bail, why do they stay? What prompts them? And the classic example would be the B2B renewal. So 1 or 2 years into the contract, are they going to renew? Are they going to buy more of the product, right? And so these are the core concepts that we use to explain how to articulate the customer journey vision that you're building towards. Once you have sort of that foundation, you've got the personas, you've got the key outcomes, you've got the vision, then we start working backwards. And, just to be clear on what we mean by product strategy, because there's a lot of definitions, what we mean is that the path to go from where you are today or where your product or your customer journey is today to realizing that end state customer journey vision. And so you can think of it a little bit in this sort of visual, right? You're trying to get from point A to point B. If you jump in on those gray rocks, you might end up sort of in the middle of the river and hopefully it doesn't start flooding and you get kind of trapped, right? And this is about thinking about what are those stepping stones to getting there. So, in order to create this sort of strategic plan, you first start with a gap analysis, which is like, wow, I have a vision of where I want my experience to look like. What are all the things that we would need in order to realize that vision, right? And so some examples, of course, would be features. You might need to have new partnerships or channels to distribute your product through. Of course, for startups, funding is important and knowing how much money you're going to need to get there. You might need to build some internal tools or operations to support the customer experience. You might need marketing content to help with discovery or evaluation in particular. And you might need data, right? You might need to say, I can only go build this vision if I have all of the requisite data that's going to allow me to build new experiences and deliver more value to customers or users. So some of the factors you might need to consider when you're actually creating the strategic plan, we talked about the fundraising side. At a startup, this is always top of mind. What's our runway? When are we going to start fundraising? And I think the key question to really ask is, what are the data points we need to show investors to prove to them that we're onto something and that we have a good sense of direction and where we're going to get to with the additional round of funding, right? And this is where the vision and the strategy can be really powerful during the fundraising cycle. You might also need to think about how do you acquire and extend a competitive advantage, right? Maybe you've created a new market and you're starting to see a lot of copycats or new entrants in there. What keeps you sticky? What makes what makes customers stick with you? It might be data, it might be the experience. There's a lot of reasons for this, but certainly something to think about as you piece together a strategic plan to make sure that you can realize the vision and that you don't falter along the way. Another consideration is if you want to serialize market segments. I'd say the most classic example that I've seen of this is a company that starts in the enterprise space and then moves down into SMB space, or vice versa from SMB to enterprise. You might also think about in the consumer space, like different types of folks, right? Single folks, parents, people with kids, those types of things. You might also think about serializing outcome delivery. What we mean by this is maybe you're delivering multiple outcomes over time to the same customer base, right? So I kind of think of Amazon Prime as the example here, right? I originally just signed up for Amazon Prime because I was interested in 2-day shipping and free 2-day shipping. Later, they added Prime Music, they added Prime Video, and I got all of these extra things sort of that were not related to my desire to get my physical products quickly, but that were interesting and valuable to me, right? So they over time they kind of increase the value of that product by delivering new outcomes for me. Technology and data dependencies. I think the classic example I think of here is LinkedIn, right? It took them a while to figure out what is the professional graph of how are people related to each other, who works where, and then from that they were able to monetize with recruiting solutions or sales solutions, but they had to have that sort of large data set up front to make it interesting that anyone would want to pay money, right? Why would you try to go recruit from a platform where there's only like 200 people using it? And finally, think about creating strategic leverage. And I think a classic example of this is sort of like partnerships. So we often would use the AT&T iPhone partnership when iPhone first launched. That was it. If you wanted an iPhone, you had to switch to AT&T. Yeah, sorry, I'm watching the chat. Please post questions and I'll do my best to pause as they come up. And we certainly have time at the end as well. So those are the factors. So now we've kind of got key outcomes, we've thought about what our vision is, we've got a strategic plan, and we've had to sequence that work into a particular order to sort of based on some of those factors we just discussed. Now we're going to talk about the reality of the world, which is very few teams could actually then just go be like, okay, we're going to spend 100% of our capacity just building towards this vision, right? And so then we created a balanced road mapping framework because we recognized that very few teams would be able to do that. And from our time in product, experiences or product roles, and then working with all these clients over the past few years, we realized there's kind of 3 categories that every product team is juggling. The first is what we would call innovation, and these are like bold changes intended to help you make progress towards your vision and strategy. Then there's iteration, which are incremental changes to the existing product, right? You might deal with, some usability issues or like a random customer request. They're going to provide incremental or iterative changes or value to customers in the business. And then there's this operational side, right? Which is the cost of operating modern SaaS platforms, performance, security, uptime, bugs, internal tooling. And what we ask teams to do is to think about a top-down allocation before they start building a roadmap or trying to slate individual initiatives or projects onto the roadmap. That is, what percentage of time do you think should go into each of these categories based on where you are in the product lifecycle, right? Early on, if you're just launching the product, you might be wrapping up your innovation of the initial vision and just iterating 100%, right? Just being very responsive to customer feedback, trying to figure out where are you getting traction, where are you not, those types of things, right? And so the other reason we ask teams to sort of categorize like this is so that you can compare apples to apples. It's really hard to stack rank a new feature against a usability issue, against a bug, against a piece of tech debt, right? But now if you have these swim lanes or sort of the categories, you can use different prioritization techniques within each of the structures. Okay, I'm going to go through the case study and then I'll pause for questions. So in order to bring all this to life, we use a sort of fictional product called Chuckwagon. And with Chuckwagon, the key outcome pyramid was targeted at consumers. And it was all about, through their customer research, they realized that people were trying to get home-cooked meals on the table much faster than they can today. So the key outcome is reducing the time spent on meals. If you break that down, and we use this pyramid structure specifically to sort of identify the KPIs, that breaks out into planning time versus actually creating the meal. And if you break planning time down further, you spent time finalizing it and then grocery shopping to get all the ingredients. If you break that down even further, you got a little plan, you're going to spend some time editing it. For groceries, you got to get to the store, you got to go through the store, check out, all that takes time. For meal creation, you got to spend time cooking. So you might be, prepping and then cooking, and then you got to clean up area, the dishes, the kitchen, all those things, right? So the key outcome is to really minimize this by 10x. And so here's the vision that we came up with for them. This is the chapters that we use. You're going to see the example. This is the trigger. It's Sharon. She's a working mom. She's got 30 minutes to make dinner after her long day. And then the ultimate point, some kid on the sofa yelling, "Mom, what's for dinner?" So she discovers through Pinterest that there's this app. It looks pretty solid. It's got a bunch of 5-star reviews. She checks out the Chuckwagon website. She feels like this might actually be pretty good. And so she gives it a shot. And that first day, she makes a meal and the family loves it. And so she continues to use the product, and the recommendations get better and better over time. She eventually starts using the grocery delivery service. And one day, for a special occasion, she actually had the chef come and make all the meals that were on her meal plan, lots of time savings. And then the retention chapter talks about how she went on vacation and the people at Chuckwagon wondered why she stopped using the service. And they email her and they set up a great order for her as soon as she gets back from vacation. And you might remember we talked about mockups being a powerful way to communicate the vision. Here's some that we did with the designer, to communicate, hey, here's how you set up your profile and create these meal plans, and boom, with one tap, you can get like a bunch of meals slated for different days. You can replace them, you can remove them if you're going to go out to dinner one day. From there, you can have your grocery list generated, so you can convert a meal plan into a grocery list and check off the items as you're walking through the grocery store. And of course, there's a call to action to actually order groceries through the app. And then finally, if you really want to save time while you're waiting for your groceries, there's a call to action to book a chef, and that person will come and make all the meals on your meal plan for the week. So if we were going to put all this together, here's sort of the vision, right? The vision was all about saving, millions of hours for Americans when it comes time to cooking. The first milestone, they realized the value prop needed to be around, saving time on meal planning. And so they built this recipe plan feature set, and they generated some revenue off of it. They proved the consumer demand for this product. And that was in order to go then to the grocery delivery services and say, wouldn't you want to do an integration with us? We've got these captive, great user base. They're looking to get groceries delivered because they're doing all this meal planning. So wouldn't you want to do an integration with us? And then finally moving into home chefs, and there is some strategy around why this was the sequencing. As I mentioned, you can't just go to Instacart or Shipt and be like, I've got 200 users in Austin, Texas, do an integration with me, right? You need to demonstrate scale that makes it interesting for them. Similarly, you may not be able to roll out home chefs. Imagine a world where there's just infinite number of recipes that these chefs have to know how to make. And so, it would be complicated logistically to figure out how to get the chefs to the right places with the right ingredients on the right day at the right time and make any recipe. So there were some constraints. We knew that there was a finite number of recipes that the product offered, and now the chefs can be trained to handle maybe just 50 or 100 dishes, and they know that they're always going to be making those types of things, and that makes it much more operationally feasible. So this is sort of the strategy. And then here's an example of the Chuckwagon roadmap. You note that the sort of swim lanes are oriented around innovation versus iteration and operation. We kind of emphasize the job to be done in the KPI and use sort of a now, soon, later road mapping technique. So there is a whole case study. I will, of course, share the deck afterwards. And so with that, let me pause here. I've been talking for a long time. What questions do y'all have?
So this was great so far. People, please share your questions that you have. I've actually got one that I hope can kick off the conversation. Uh, you mentioned digging deeply to find key outcomes, and I wondered, how do you know how far to dig? Like you mentioned, some people, the goal is not for people to chat; they want to achieve goals together. That was one example. How do you know when you've dug deeply enough? How do you find that?
Yeah, it's a great question, because if you dug too deep, you'd just be you'd get to the deeply personal outcomes for every single person you talk to, regardless of whether it was in the context of the B2B world. And so the top of everyone's personal key outcome pyramid might be a variety of things. So um, I think the question to ask is, what are that person's metrics of success? So the classic example, Blake, here in the B2B context, my favorite question during a customer discovery interview in the warm up, early stages of that interview, is just, what are the goals that the company has? Because I know that if my product is not related to achieving one of those OKRs or one of their own KPIs, I have an uphill battle on the sales cycle, right? If it's not top of mind because it's not related to anything that the company is trying to accomplish, I know that it's like not relevant, right? And you can imagine what most of these things are, right? Revenue growth, but there's a question about like, okay, but is that revenue growth happening through like new logos? Is it retaining existing customers? Is it expanding the relationships with existing customers? And some of those things matter because you can imagine how the product experience might need to be different based on what those were. Um,
Great question. Oh, so a couple of people have asked if they can get a copy of the presentation. I don't know if those will be available yet, but
Yes, 100%. I will definitely make it available and work with the product camp folks to figure out how to distribute it.
that's awesome. Thank you for that. Ariel asks, can you speak a little more to how you recommend budgeting for innovative, iterative, and operational roadmap work, depending on the company stage?
Yeah, Ariel, great question. I actually have a slide on it. I left it out just for time reasons, though. So we use the S curves of innovation as like sort of the framework to help answer this question. If you've ever seen them, it basically suggests that like over time, the value that a product would deliver to like either customers or the business like ends up plateauing. And so as you start realizing that you're starting to flatten out on sort of the value creation curve, that's the time to start thinking about how to innovate and generate the next wave of value for customers or the business, right? And so there's these S's that start forming like kind of intertwined with each other. And so what we think about is where is the product on that life cycle, right? Early on in the alpha stage, you're like putting something out there. You're probably still like, mostly executing on a vision of what you think the customers need and releasing that first version. And then afterwards, you're iterating like crazy probably to like find product market fit. And then once you find that product market fit, then you're sort of on this like the uphill slope of the S, probably focusing a lot on operations because you're trying to scale the business efficiently and get the product into the hands of as many people as possible. Well, guess what? That flood of new customers is going to create a lot of operational challenges internally. And so that's when internal tooling and things like that become much more relevant, performance, scalability. So you might transition a little bit more onto the operational side of things. So Ariel, I will sort of share my contact information in the deck as well. Just ping me if you want to see that slide.
Excellent. So Valerie also asks, can you give some advice on any differences for products that are used infrequently? For instance, like once or twice a year versus like daily or weekly?
Yeah, Valerie, one of my clients is actually writing a great article about this, and he just sent me a draft. He works at a company where they like help people find apartments or buy houses, and so he was just talking about this. I think the key thing here is number one, understanding what are the criteria that those people are using when they decide to choose, one product over another, even for those infrequent things like renting an apartment. And I think obviously this is the hard thing on the marketing side of stuff is like how do you remain top of mind so that the next time they're trying to do something that they remember that you exist in the world because it's quite possible they forgot. Even if they had a good experience, they might have forgotten that your product exists, right? So I think there's sort of a memory or recall challenge there.
And then next, I think we've got, oh, so Rex was mentioning, how do you align the stakeholder to balance the mix of features versus tech debt and security and compliance stuff that you've got to deal with?
Yeah, Rex, it's tough. I think what's surprising, and there's a case study that you can find on our site. I'll see if I can put it on the deck, but um, we created this system called sales tokens at opower, which is the energy efficiency startup, and then it turned into a Harvard Business School case. But basically, what happened was the execs, our CEO, our VP of product, and then the head of sales got into a room, and they were just like, our Ben, who's like my co-author, he was the VP of product, and he basically was like, I can't just keep building random one-off requests for sales to close deals. We'll never make progress towards where we want to go to. And so he asked the question like, let's come up with sort of like a budget almost for how much of our product development capacity should go towards closing deals. And they actually relatively quickly ended up with an 85-15 like ratio, and they all agreed that that seemed reasonable. And what happened afterwards is the sales team did exactly what we wanted, we would have done as product managers. They started prioritizing their requests, and they were like, it's not worth asking for this thing because we only have so many tokens to like take over on the sort of like to get product roadmap capacity. And so they prioritized the things that were valuable to lots of clients instead of just one-offs. And so that's a kind of a story, and I'll see if I can send the case study link.
Great answer. We've got about 4 minutes left in the session, and then we'll wrap it up. So we've got one or two more questions. For anyone who has additional questions we can't get to, don't forget we'll have breakout rooms and networking afterward through work.me. So Jay asked, for a startup team with only a single person working on product and a technical contractor, how would you suggest that product person spends their limited time to, produce these things?
Jay, what I would guess is at an early stage in the startup, some of these things may be irrelevant, right? If you're just trying to find product market fit, what we found is that the vision kind of doesn't matter. You already had a vision, you're already executing on it. What matters is once you find the product market fit, what often happens is there's sort of like 3 or 4 viable paths, and there's a very tough decision to be made at the company of like which of these paths do we want to follow. And that's often where we bring the framework in, is more at like the Series A fundraising standpoint, where like there's some traction, or maybe Series B. So I think early on, focus on just finding product market fit, building something that customers love, and then you can start thinking about the vision, perhaps as the fundraising storytelling process, or as things get more complicated.
Awesome. Oh, and then one more, I think, from Samuel, and then we probably better wrap it up. Would this framework work with service products, service-focused products?
Um, Yeah, it's a great question. I think it could, right? So if you're trying to, if you have a, more of a face-to-face or human-based service, I think there's still a question of like, where do we take this? In fact, I am going through this exact framework myself right now as I think about what the next few years for Productify holds, and where should we go as a product advisory coaching firm. So I think you could, and I think it's important. The framework is intended to intentionally put the focus on customers and what do they need, what else can we do to help them really. And I think even whether it's a digital product or a service, I think you could still use the framework.
We might have time for one more. I saw it earlier. So Dr. James Andrews asked, are there any techniques for getting executives on board who may be hyper-focused on hitting, revenue, EDITA numbers and such?
Yeah, James, I think this is a tough question. It comes down to their perception of what the role of product is, right? And also how customer centric they are. So the thing that we normally talk about when we talk about key outcomes is the business has key outcomes. Of course, everyone's got something with a dollar sign in front of it that represents their goals. But those are usually lagging indicators of value creation for customers. And so the question starts to become, where should the team spend their time? If you're trying to, we use a sponge analogy. If you're trying to squeeze more sort of water out of the sponge because you've got customers and you could extract more value from them, it may make more sense to say, yep, what are the iterative things we're going to do to close more deals and upsell more customers? And there's more value that we can create inside of where we are right now. That might be different from, realizing that you're starting to hit that plateau on the value creation curve, and you need to start thinking about the next wave of innovation, which is like, we would call that re-wetting the sponge, right? Which is like, how do I pour more water on the sponge so that we can squeeze out more as a business? And so I think it sort of depends on the life cycle stage. But at the end of the day, I'd say the best sort of thing to talk about is like, why would customers pay us more money, right? And I think a lot of teams work backwards from the revenue number to get there, which is fine. But eventually, you have to start saying like, what is the price point? What's the ARPA, and why would they pay us that?